Scott Jennings is a CNN political commentator and former special assistant to President George W. Bush, and he joins me now from Louisville, Kentucky. Also, Basil Smrkel is a Democratic strategist and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, and he joins me from New York. Gentlemen, great to see you. Scott, to you first. What's your reaction to the speech? A very long speech, it must be said.
Yeah, it was too long. I mean, the speech had some good lines and some good riffs and themes, but a lot of the most powerful parts I thought were diluted by some of the more meandering parts that really should have been left on the cutting room floor.
That's interesting. Basil, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I actually agree. I think that the speech was very long, and for having a convention when you've got 1,000 people outside the South Lawn of the White House, you would expect a little more energy, a little bit more oomph, particularly right at the end there. But you didn't get that. I think he hit the marks he needed to get thematically, contextually. But I don't know if the speech was the sort of rousing speech that you would expect for a convention speech of this nature.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, from your point of view, what are the marks that he needed to hit? And is that very much in part, of the narrative that we've seen over the past 4 days? I mean, there certainly seems to be this law and order narrative that threads through a lot of this. Was that the standout theme for you, or was there something else?
No, I think that law and order theme is exactly where the Republicans are headed, that their argument will be that the Democrats simply are too weak to stand up to the anarchists who are burning American cities, and I'll take care of it. I also thought they set up some interesting contrasts on other sort of domestic policy items, particularly on taxes and other economic matters. So my anticipation for the fall campaign is that public safety, and I'll get us back to the economy we had. They'll plunge us further into economic chaos. That's going to be the Republican message, and that's what they set up with the convention this week.
But in many ways, and I mean, this is Mr. Biden, Joe Biden is coming out and saying that it's in many ways a hypocritical argument, because a lot of the protests and the riots, we're seeing the unsafety that we're seeing and being painted by the Trump administration on the streets is playing out in his administration. There's a disconnect between those words and what's actually happening in the streets during his presidency.
Yeah, well, the Trump administration would say these things are happening in states with Democratic mayors and Democratic governors. And the Trump administration has also sent in federal troops into certain areas to try to arrest people who are trying to burn down federal courthouses and are attacking innocent bystanders. So I think the point that the Republicans are trying to make is where you have weak Democrats in local government, they are not handling the situation.
Basil, on that point, is there a chance, is there a concern by Democrats that these protests, genuine as they are perhaps playing into Mr. Trump's narrative?
I mean, it's a great question, but I would answer that just by saying that the country's view of the protesters and why they're protesting, I think, has shifted considerably, certainly within the last 2 years. You know, our national pastimes, whether it be baseball or basketball, you have athletes now canceling playoff games, teams canceling playoff games, and working with both the Players Association and the league leaders to do this in solidarity over the issue of racial unrest and social justice. So we are long past the taking of the knee.
I just want to continue that conversation, because what we've also seen, and it was fascinating to see just how many African-American men came out and told stories or gave testimonials in the past few days. Even just the cutaway pictures in the White House today tried to reflect a multicultural or diverse audience listening to President Trump. I mean, Basil, from your point of view, there seems to be some sort of outreach, or at least a veneer of multiculturalism and non-racial. Who is the president targeting there? A small group of African-American voters, perhaps, in key states, or those white voters who feel uncomfortable with the racist undertones of some of this administration?
Well, you can paint me as a little bit cynical, because I think the majority of that outreach is meant. There's some of it that's genuine in terms of winning some African-American support, but I think a lot of it goes toward assuaging concerns among white voters that he isn't doing enough to reach across racial and ethnic, into racial and ethnic constituencies. Because whether you're Democrat or Republican, no matter who you are as a leader, you acknowledge there's some diversity and want at least your leader to make an effort to engage the diverse constituencies.
So just finally, with both of you, out of 10 perhaps, how would you rate the last few days?
Ooh, I'll let Scott go first.
Oh, well, I will say, I'll give you a broad answer. I think both parties, given the circumstances, did a fine job putting on conventions under really weird circumstances. So good job to both parties. This Republican convention exceeded all of my expectations. Most of the speakers, with a few exceptions, I thought really did a nice job and belonged and had compelling stories. So I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. And I'll take off one tick mark for the president's too long speech tonight.
Okay.
I'll actually agree with that, too. I think for each of their constituencies, they hit really high marks. I was actually pleasantly surprised. I didn't think the Democrats were going to have the kind of convention they had. And you have a lot of Democrats saying, we don't want to go back to the old convention. We kind of like this setup, which was pleasantly surprising. So I'll give them a 10 for that. And for the Republicans, I think Donald Trump and the Republicans did exactly what they needed to do for their own constituency. I'll take off more than a half point. I'll take off a full point for a fully long speech, a speech way too long, way too long. And on the South Lawn at that, like, who does that? But he does that.
Yeah, and again, the imagery also another, another
important
indication of how this president has certainly bunked tradition. To you both, to Basil and to Scott, thank you for your expertise. Thanks very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Robin.